All right, guys, this is Chapter 3 on demand, supply, and market equilibrium. We're going to discuss markets, supply, market equilibrium, also known as a clearing price. It's when you order the perfect amount of inventory and it sells out in the last 5 minutes before closing. Right? That's the example of equilibrium. Changes in supply, how that can impact things, changes in demand, and as I just talked about, equilibrium. Markets, that's an interaction between buyers and sellers. Markets can be national, local, international. One of the interesting things that happened, in the last 10 years is lumber mills. Used to be like 20 or 30 companies that own lumber mills. Now there's like 3 or 4 big ones. So during the pandemic, lumber prices were really high, but the logs were really cheap. So they were able to, kind of capture a huge market, right? And if you were, had a log to sell, if you only have 3 places to sell it, that's not a big market to sell to. So effectively, you don't have any negotiating power, and you can't even bring it to the next lumber mill because the cost of transporting the log would eat into your profits. Um, a quick example right there. Price is discovered by interactions between buyers and sellers. What does that mean? When you go to sell a house, you might have an idea what you're going to get for it, but you could be off by like 25, 50 grand. But you figure out what it's worth when you accept an offer, right? No different than like buying or selling a collectible online. It's worth what other people are willing to pay for it. So demand, a schedule or curve that shows various amounts of a product that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each series of possible prices during specified periods of time. And we talked about this in class a few times. Effectively, with demand, it's downward sloping. So, how much food do you want to eat? How much will you pay for it? You'd pay, $10 for a burger, but what's your demand for a third burger or a fourth burger? Like zero, you wouldn't pay anything for that. Amount of consumers are willing and able to purchase at any given time, assuming all things being equal, and that there's individual demand leading to market demand. Law of demand, other things equal, as price falls, the quantity demanded rises, and as price rises, quantity demanded falls. This isn't always true. We'll talk about this later, but some items are inelastic, to a point anyway. So for example, like gas, between $2 and $5, or you're not really like changing your driving habits. Your purchasing actually won't change, but we'll get into that later. So some examples, explanations here is price acts as an obstacle to buyers. So even with that example I just gave for gas, gas goes to $10 a gallon, all of a sudden demand is elastic, right? You'll find ways to cut driving. Law of diminishing marginal utility. That's exactly like the burger thing I mentioned a few minutes ago, where that first burger provides a lot of utility to you, right? You're like not hungry anymore, but the fourth burger provides zero utility. Here's an example of a demand curve, downward sloping, as we just discussed. So at $5 a bushel, the market only demands 10. But if a bushel is only $1, the market will demand, close to 80. And again, these are just different, what it's showing here is these individuals all have different demand curves. And in aggregate on the right here is, what they would be, that would be the market effectively, right? All the individual demand curves, aggregated up. And just another example of that right here. What's showing here is a shift in demand curve, right? One reason why a demand curve can shift is, people's income gets higher, right? That will cause a huge shift in demand. Why? Well, if everyone gets a $20,000 raise, the demand for cars will go up for sure, right? Why? Because everyone has extra 20 grand. Some percentage of those people are going to go, hey, I'm just going to buy a new car. There can be a decrease in demand. Income is just an easy one to explain. Everyone gets laid off. The demand for champagne drops, right? Detriments of demand or determinants of a demand, changing consumer taste and preferences, change in number of buyers, change in income. Is it a normal or an inferior good? So, an example I'll just continue to use is like filet mignon, right? Um, your income goes up. Filet mignon is a normal good. Your demand for filet mignon goes up as your income goes up. But what's the opposite of that? Maybe like ramen noodles, right? So there's like an inverse relationship between ramen noodles and you know your income. As the more money you make, the less ramen you eat. Change in prices of related goods. So complementary. We might have mentioned this in class, but what would happen if they made the train completely free? What would be an unintended consequence? One would be that the parking lots would be able to charge more money, right? We've increased the demand for the train by lowering the price to zero. So what's going to happen? The parking lots are going to get more full because you're encouraging people to go on the train. So what are they going to do with the parking lots? They're going to charge you more money, right? So you could even make a case by making the train free. Maybe it's a little bit cheaper, but some of those savings are actually captured by the parking lots. There's also substitute goods. So think of like chicken, fish, beef, tofu, you name it, right? Like there's plenty of substitutes in food, right? It keeps the prices of everything fairly relatively stable. Changing consumer expectations. What do they think about what will happen in the future? Well, change prices today. And then what do they expect about their future income? When do you buy a boat? You buy a boat not only when you have money today, but you expect to have money tomorrow. That's why in this economic environment, one concern is like, oh, maybe the market or the consumer gets too scared and stops spending money. Although, in my experience right now, it doesn't seem that's the case. So here's just another, verbalizing some examples that we've kind of already discussed. Changes in buyers' tastes, things rise and fall in popularity. Look at the Peloton bike, right? Changing the number of buyers. Baby boomers are a big part of the population. The next biggest group, or they're the second biggest group. The biggest group is people in their early 30s. You could create a business, around just knowing demographics. Change in income, we already discussed. Change in prices of related goods, we discussed. And change in consumer expectations. So one thing is they're worried about the coffee harvest right now in Brazil, and that it might be come up short. So what happens? The coffee prices today go up in price. Supply. A supply curve is always upward sloping. It's the opposite of the demand curve. It shows various amounts of a product that producers are willing and able to make available for sale at each of a series of possible prices during a specified period of time. Supply schedule or supply curve, we just discussed. Amount of producers are willing and able to sell given a price. There's an individual supply, just like the demand, and there's a market supply, again, just like the demand. Law of supply, all other things equal, as prices rise, the quantity supplied rises faster. Sorry. Other things equal, as the price rises, the quantity supplied rises, and as the price falls, the quantity supplied falls. Explanation: prices act as an incentive to producers, right? If you see like one company opens up and they're the only frozen yogurt store in town and they're killing it, they're making a ton of money, what are you going to do? Or what is someone else going to do? They're going to be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to open up a frozen yogurt store too, right? And then, X amount of time later, you have a glut of frozen yogurt stores, and then they all go out of business. And this, happened in Boston like the last 7 years. That's a legit local example. At some point, costs will rise as well. What does that mean? At some point, costs will rise. Um, if I try to add more product to the market, like I can only add more financial advice to the market. Then I need to hire someone. That's going to cost money. I'll need to get more services, more licenses. If you're like a restaurant, you can only get so busy, right? There's capacity issues. Or if you have a factory, right, you can pay all your workers for 40 hours and give them a salary. But if they have to work overtime, that's an incremental increase in your costs too. And this is just showing the shifts of supply curves, right? So we have a decrease in supply curve moves to the left, increase in supply curve moves to the right. Pretty straightforward. One thing I'll mention, as I said, pretty straightforward, is that, what it said there in summary, without even seeing the numbers, is that at $5 for a piece of corn, the market would provide a lot of corn at $5. But if corn was only $1, less people will supply it. So what changes, what will cause supply to change? Change in resource prices. Think about car shortage, microchips, how that's impacting it. So, microchips are expensive. So car companies are having a hard time, getting the chips for the cars. Change in technology. Think about the change from like broadband to like using the internet completely over your cell phone in the last 10 years. A change in the number of sellers, change in the number of taxes and subsidies. We'll talk about that later, but is your good taxed, right? Like look at cigarettes. Is your good subsidized? The train is a good example of the subsidy already, right? Like even though it costs like, $3 to ride the train, like the cost of that is more than what you're paying. A change in price of other goods, a change in producer expectations. So some home builders are like cutting back on building a little bit because they're like, hey, we don't want to be overbuilding into a recession. But what could happen is the economy is just fine, and then we still have somewhat of a house shortage. And again, this is just going over what we just discussed. This is a good summary slide. So was the last one. I would make note of these for a future quiz that we'll have. Equilibrium occurs when the demand curve and supply curve intersect. That's the equilibrium price. That's where your inventory clears. It's also called the inventory clearing price. There's no surplus or shortage. You sold out completely by the time you closed. And that would be the most efficient allocation also. Productive efficiency, producing goods in the least costly way, right? Using the best technology, using the right mix of resources to get your goods produced. Trying to think of a good example here, but there are some exceptions to this, right? And then also says like what is cost? So you would say, oh, we can make T-shirts made in China, and they'll be the cheapest. But even though it's the cheapest, you may say, hey, you know what? I think it's gonna be better because you don't know about sanctions or anything else like that. So let's just make them in the U.S. and it's more expensive. But you're still actually choosing the most efficient way, right? Because you're baking in a cost to a risk of regulations not working out in your favor. Using the right mix of resources. Think about when you have a factory and someone's putting something together. If labor is cheap, you'll use more human labor. If labor is expensive, you'll use more automation and robots. Look at McDonald's, any new McDonald's in the US. Allocative efficiency, producing the right mix of goods, combination of goods most highly valued by society. And there's an example of, the equilibrium price, right? With today's demand and today's supply, you're going to see here that the corn or whatever this is sells for, $3 a bushel. Rationing function of market prices. So the ability of the competitive forces of demand and supply to establish a price at which selling and buying decisions are consistent, right? So, also helps keep things stable as well. Good chart showing shifts in supply and demand curves right here. So, effectively in the first chart, it's showing demand shifting to the right. So demand shifts to the right, what happens? prices go up, right? And the market, is willing to supply more. We're paying a higher price. More people will come into the market. Um, then this one right here, decrease in demand, just showing the opposite, right? Decrease in demand moves to the left on the demand curve, right? Lower supply is brought to market, and then the prices drop. Increase in supply, like this little formula right here, we saw these in the last slides. Supply increase, what happens? Price down, quantity up. Um, that's also supply decrease. So you'll see here what happens to the price, right? Where those lines intersect, becomes the new clearing price. When more supply is added, with the same demand, more supply, prices go down. Same demand again, but supply becomes less, prices go up. Some of this is a reason why I'm not too negative on housing. It's like, all right, well, supplies are still really tight, so that's actually going to push prices higher, even while higher interest rates hurt home prices today. This is a great chart to study on for next exam. It goes over everything we just discussed. Just a great summary slide. Talking about a price ceiling, set below equilibrium price. What happens when it's set below equilibrium price? You can also get black markets. So if I had a rent-controlled apartment, and in this rent-controlled apartment, I effectively didn't want to live there anymore, but I'm only paying $500 a month for it, but it's worth $2,000 a month. So instead of like telling the landlord I'm moving out, I might like find someone on Airbnb or rent it to someone I know and say, hey, you give me $2,000. Meanwhile, the owner's only getting 500, right? We've created a black market because of the price ceiling. If we allow the owner to, and it's not always perfect, allowing complete, freedom in markets, but if we allow the owner to rent it out at the fair price and reset the price every year, the market will function better. So what it says here in this chart is that if you put a price cap on something, there'll be a shortage, right? Why? Because, hey, if we've changed what the most you can take for rent, we'll have less people willing to enter the rental business. Price floor, prices are set above market price. This can lead to surpluses. So, criticism of minimum wage is that it creates unemployment because, that person would be hired somewhere, but not for the price the market is asking. But I think, that kind of issue with minimum wage is a much more local or regional issue than it is a national issue because it's all about that area's cost of living. An example of a price floor right here, and there's going to be what is the example for unemployment would be that there's a surplus of unemployment. Student loans and tuition costs. So, actually this is pretty timely because of the debt forgiveness, but, there's a direct relationship between the ability for students to get loans and the increase in the rate of college education, right? So you could say, hey, maybe we should make maybe loans more difficult, but would that be good for society? That's a whole nother debate. I would say probably not, but I don't know if the system is the best right now because the amount of debt you have to take on in some of these colleges can be pretty wild. Again, economic research finds that loans were a major cause to rising tuition costs, right? You could say the same thing about cars too, right? But we're not making that same criticism here, right? But financing allows more people to buy cars.